Thank you very much. So yeah, burn your idiomatic Ruby. So this is a rough draft of a talk that I'm going to give next month at RubyConf Australia. So thank you for your patience and understanding if not everything is up to snuff. And yeah, as you see, it's about idiomatic Ruby. So to start, it's a word that many programmers use, but what does it mean exactly, and why is it something that we would want? Let's start there. So idiomatic is an adjective meaning relating to or conforming to idiom. So that's the first step, but of course then we ask the question, well, what is idiom? And idiom comes from the Greek, idios meaning personal, something that is particular to one's own, or something that is peculiar, something that stands out. And so from that derives the meaning something that a peculiarity, and especially a peculiar way of saying something. And so that's one way of defining idiom. So in modern English, idiom actually has two different but related meanings. One is sort of the way of speaking, the variety of language that a certain group uses. And I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. And the other one, sort of smaller but related meaning, is a specific phrase, a peculiar expression that you can't really understand unless you know the expression and know what it means. You can't understand it by the constituent parts alone. So we'll start with the second one. So example of English idioms are to kick the bucket, or I'm pulling your leg, or I wouldn't put it past him. So these are phrases that a second language learner would have to learn phrase by phrase. They're not self-obvious. Another way that you notice this is that you can't literally translate them, for instance, to German. They wouldn't make sense. You can try that in your head. It'll probably sound funny. Now, in these kind of idioms, we have in Ruby as well, and in other programming languages. So in a way, you can think of this as kind of the tiniest, the smallest design pattern. They're not really design patterns as such, but it's kind of in the same space. So an example of this is memoization. So an experienced Rubyist will look at this method, and instead of seeing that there's an instance variable and a conditional assignment, and the instance variable and the method have the same name, they sort of, in one glance, they see that, okay, this is just a method that memoizes its results. Similarly, another one that we have are these method preconditions. So you look at the method, and the first couple lines are raise if this, raise if that. You immediately kind of see like, okay, this is just not essential to the method itself, but it's precondition checks, sort of defensive programming. So these are examples of Ruby idioms in the second sense. In the first sense, so a way of speaking that is particular to a specific group. So we have this in English as well. An example of this is Eurospeak, or Brussels English. So if you go hang around the European Parliament or the European institutions in Brussels, you might hear some very funny phrases. And actually, there's whole posts and whole articles about this, how there's actually words in official European documents that are used in a way that's just not what they mean in English. Like a European parliamentarian might talk about the actual president. What they mean is the current president. But in French, it's actuellement. So there's a lot of stuff like that. And of course, all the jargon, you know, instead of plan something, they planize something, stuff like that. Or you might remember from high school kids around the world have their own idiom, which is different from the idiom that their teachers use, and might even be specific to their peer group and different from the idiom that people in another class use. So these kind of idioms we have in programming languages as well. So in the case of Ruby, for instance, we have the Rails idiom. So people that develop on Rails or that develop Rails applications tend to do things in a certain way. And now we're talking about a style of naming things, propensity to use certain methods from the standard library and using others less, using certain tools, organizing things in a certain way. And this, for instance, is quite different from what the Ruby core people do. If you look at a standard library, it's quite a different style, quite a different idiom. Seattle RB, not a good example. Ryan Davis and friends, they've always been known to kind of do their own thing. All their projects are similar, but in subtle ways different from sort of the bigger community. And then, yeah, Data Mapper ROM is also a small group of people that have just sort of figured out their own highly opinionated way of writing Ruby. Now, one interesting to note here is that this is not a constant. This evolves over time. Even when we talk about, so we've talked about idioms within the Ruby community. Of course, we can also just talk about, well, you know, what's the typical peculiar way that Rubyists in general tend to write in 2015, 2016 their code. So that's kind of the bigger Ruby idiom. But also that has evolved over time. So I dug back, not really to the very early days of Ruby, but sort of, so in English they talk about early English and middle English and modern English. So these are some examples of middle Ruby. So I looked at the Ruby standard library. I looked at a project that I was involved in, Nitro, the Nitro web framework. It kind of died in 2006, 2007, but I managed to find it was still on Darks. Did anybody use Darks? Couldn't find the repo anymore, but I found the gem that was published in 2006, had a look at that. Found little bits here and there, so I had a look around, and also had a look around at Rails code, DHH's code from 2004. Yeah, I hope that that's still readable. Color scheme's not ideal. So a couple things that you notice here. This is from the standard library. An actual for loop. When's the last time you saw a for loop? And then when you look a bit closer, they're using this to loop over a range, just to pull things out of two arrays. So modern Ruby equivalent would probably be something like names.zip params.each. Another example from the standard library, so instead of using the string matching operator, they use the .match method on regular expressions, which I find looks especially funny when you have these modifiers on the rejects and then the method coming after that. So that's one thing you notice here. Use of these fully spelled out booleans. They're different from the ones you see more often in that they have a different what's the word? Precedence, exactly. And then one other interesting thing is here. So this is just a class method, a static method, and so it's called, instead of with just a dot, it's called with this scoping operator. And in fact, when you look at the definition of this method, it's also defined with the scoping operator. Right, so times change. And so talking about idiom, and then what does idiomatic mean? Well, idiomatic means that you conform to a certain idiom. And when it comes to natural language, that basically comes down to you're sounding natural. So if I say, come with me, that's quite idiomatic. If I say, follow me along, that's already a little bit less idiomatic. You'll understand me, but it's not how a native speaker would say it. And one side effect of that is that actually it takes a little bit more mental processing to understand me. Not significantly, not a lot, but still, if you use idiomatic language, it just it goes in very smoothly. Whereas if you say things in a funny way, people are going to like, all right, I know what you're saying, but so when it comes to code, why is that interesting, and what do we want to do with it? So one reason that people say that your code should be idiomatic is that you want to make good use of the language that you're writing. So Ruby gives you certain constructs, or any other language gives you certain constructs, certain ways of doing things that are efficient or concise, and so using them in a good way gives you good, concise, readable, efficient code. Whereas if you would go the long way around and maybe implement it in your own way because you kind of have you don't really know the idiomatic way, but you're coming from a different language and you're kind of just using the patterns that were common there, then maybe you end up with something that's just not ideal. And secondly, but also very important because code is read much more often than written, it's easier on the people looking at your code. They recognize the patterns, they more quickly see what's going on. And it's especially important within projects. So we've seen that there are many Ruby idioms, and not everybody has to write the exact same style of Ruby. But it's important within projects to be consistent, to pick a style and to stick with it. The reason being that when you do this in a good way, then you get code that looks like it's been written by one person, even though it's been written by dozens of people. And through that, you get a shared sense of ownership. If people all kind of stick to their own idiom, their own idiomatic style, their own peculiar style, instead of the style of the group, then you'll get the situation where, okay, I'm not going to touch that file because you can clearly see that that's John's turf. And again, mentioned before, reduce cognitive overhead. You just kind of more easily see what's going on. So when you look at the Ruby idiom over time, I kind of want to split it in 3 eras. The first, the second, and the modern era. So the first era, I'm just going to arbitrarily delineate as being 1995 to 2005. First 10 years of Ruby's existence. AKA the primordial ooze. So these were early days for Ruby. Still very niche language, just barely getting out of Japan. And so pretty much everyone was an early adopter. People were coming from Perl, from C, from Lisp, from Smalltalk. And so there was a lot of variety, a lot of different styles. People were trying stuff out. People were figuring out how they would find the good style in this new language. And then in 2005, what happened? Rails. So suddenly adoption of Ruby booms. I think in 2006 we probably had a multiple of the amount of people doing in Ruby in the world than we had in 2004. And an interesting side effect of that is that suddenly the majority is a beginner again. So in 2005, 2006, probably the majority of people doing Ruby was doing it for less than a year. So they didn't necessarily have a strong opinion about how to write Ruby. And so they kind of looked at Rails, and so Idiom kind of crystallized around the Rails style. That said, at the same time, it was still an exciting time where coming out of this, with the heritage of Perl, which is kind of inspired by natural languages, which is a very flexible language. Ruby is also a very flexible language. It attracts people who like to be expressive in their code. And so, Y was still around, encouraging everybody to be creative in their code. And so you had a bit of that as well. But then we fast forward a couple years, and these people that started all their apps, their Rails apps, their startups, are now a couple years in, and they have to maintain these apps for several years, and they're starting to notice the pain points. And they found out that some of their more creative colleagues have caused them a lot of pain. And so people, there's a desire to professionalize, to standardize on best practices, to come up with more consistent ways of doing this. And so generally, sort of a common style is adopted by the community. In 2011, Božidar Bacov starts writing the Ruby style guide. 2012, he starts writing Rubocop, and so to say, the rest is history. Now, 2010, 2015, there's also kind of the parallel track, which is people that are turning away from the Rails world and saying, okay, well, actually, we've done Ruby for long enough now, we know this language inside and out, and we don't think that everything that's sort of become standard is necessarily ideal. And we have our own opinions, and we're going to try new things, different things, and around certain projects, they form their own idioms. And so this begs an interesting question, namely, when we talk about idiomatic Ruby, and you should write idiomatic Ruby. By the way, fun fact, if you Google idiomatic on the GitHub issue tracker, then and you normalize by the amount of repositories for each language, then Ruby is second in line, most likely to mention idiomatic. The language that most talks about idiomatic, again normalized by amount of repositories, is Go. And they actually talk about it 7 more times than Ruby people. Whereas we talk about idiomatic about twice as much as the JavaScript people. So we do like our code to be idiomatic. And so ideally, if we look at 2011, Božidar starts writing his style guide. At that point, it was mostly encoding what was already common practice in the community, of course, also with some of his own preferences. But where is that common style really coming from? And what I found super interesting when I looked at code from various different sources, all from 2004, standard lib and various projects, every single one, you pick 1 or 2 files at random, you scroll a bit, and there's stuff in there that's like, whoa. Very little so with Rails. I looked at some commits from DHH, and the only thing that struck me as a bit funny is his way of indenting private, which he still does. But for the rest, it's very much, looks very much like modern Ruby, like the way that we would write it today. And so I think that that's no coincidence that sort of our modern standard has kind of evolved from DHH's style. Now, all of that said, there's a good reason that we have these style guides. There's a good reason that we have strong desire for idiomatic code. It does also come with some downsides, especially when you really go far with it. If you look at the amount of rules that Rubocop has these days, if you look at the length of the Ruby style guide, you basically need a weekend to read that thing. And so this is when you're coming into the language as a newcomer, this is an extra thing that you need to learn, because you try to write some code, you try to contribute to a project, and people will come screaming at you saying it's not idiomatic. And you notice this when you start coaching, that you really have to bite your tongue, and they get the indentation all wrong, and let them do that, by all means. But if they really want to get into the community and they really want to get their code accepted, they're going to have to learn that stuff. But also, and especially, the thing with idiomatic is that, okay, we have some encoding of it in style guides, but to a large extent, it's intuitive. We look at code, and if it looks nice to us, we consider it idiomatic. But if we treat idiomatic as the norm, if we say okay, it has to be that way, then we might be holding back some innovation. And times are changing, because the only constant is change. And when a society changes, then its language tends to change. And also when a society comes into contact with other languages, and then its own language evolves, takes on idioms, takes on words from the other language. And so we are now in a time where we have new challenges with distributed systems, new opportunities as well with parallelization, multi-core systems. People are trying out different concurrency models, different type systems, and Ruby programmers are coming into contact with these new languages, Go, Idris, Elixir, Elm, Rust, all from 2009 to now. Go is the oldest, I think, from 2009. Rust is a year or two old, really. And so people are trying out concepts that are coming from different places, that are foreign, that are alien to Ruby, and trying them out in Ruby, seeing what they can do with them. Things like monads, functional composition, the communicated sequential processes, so basically the concurrency model used in Go, that's also available in Clojure. And so these things will look unfamiliar by necessity, because they are completely alien to anything that the Ruby world has ever seen. And so I'll give you a few examples. KLEISLI is a gem that implements a couple of useful monads. So here is the try monad. Here is the maybe monad. And here's a bit of code from another library that relies on KLEISLI, where we see it unwrap the maybe monad. And then here, this left, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's like, it probably looks a bit funny if you've never seen it before. Transproc is a dependency of ROM used heavily in ROM. It's basically a concise way to do functional composition of defining functional transformations on data. Again, is this idiomatic? I don't know. Does it have to be, or who decides, or does that matter? It's a big question. It's a loaded question. Transducers, concept pioneered in Clojure and then ported to various languages. Agent is an implementation of communicating sequential processes. So the takeaway of this is basically that idiom is fluid and that you should treat it as such. So don't be too rigid about what you discard because of it. And programming is a form of expression. And just as in writing, also in programming, you need to find your own voice, which also means reading and listening to your contemporaries and seeing what is acceptable in the wider community, but it also finding a way of expression that suits you. And just because it's idiomatic does not imply that it's good, or the other way around, because you don't think it's idiomatic does not mean that it's bad. So go beyond face value and try to see what's really there. So that's it for the talk, basically. I'm Plexus on GitHub and Twitter. Yax is a Ruby library for building hypermedia APIs that I wrote. Chestnut is not a project of mine. If you're into Clojure, it's an application template for web applications. And like I said, this is a try run for Australia, so I'm very happy with any feedback. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? No. Well, then I have a question. Oh, okay, there was a question.
Yeah, give it a minute.
Are we still in modern era?
Sorry?
Are we still in modern era?
Modern, postmodern. That's how you look at it. I think we're still in the modern era, but if some of these things gain traction, then maybe we really are fully in the postmodern times.
Will you have another talk if you leave the modern era and go to postmodern? So that we all realize.
If I will do another talk, I'll try to keep an eye out and make sure I'll send out a notice. Yeah.
See you in 5 years.